In today's video, I'll be taking a look at the iPad Air 3, or just called the iPad, or some people call this the iPad Air 2019 edition, because this is going to be the successor to the iPad Air 2 that came out about in 2014. So you can see this is the successor to that line. Really quickly, I just want to say in this video is going to be an extremely long video, so you have been warned. And also, I really didn't actually pick this tablet up for myself, so I don't know if I would actually pick this up for myself. The only reason why I actually own this tablet at the moment is because I actually got it as a very late Christmas present, and I've actually owned this tablet now for about a week, maybe week and a half now, and I've been using it pretty solidly, so I can give my final opinions on this tablet. Now, right now, I'm going to talk about the other iPads that Apple currently has on the market, because Apple does currently have 3 other versions on the market, and they have an iPad 7th generation, which is the base model, and that's the cheapest option, which will run you $350. They have the iPad Air 3, which you're currently looking at right now, are just called the iPad Air. It's going for $500. And then they also have the iPad Pro line, which the iPad Pro line I think starts at about $800. So you can see it's a very expensive tablet. The thing is, as of the recording of this video, it looks like Apple has no plans to refresh the iPad line in early 2020. It looks like they will be refreshing it, but it looks like they won't be refreshing it until the later half of the year. So if you are watching this video in early 2020, it does look like you'll still be in luck, and you can still buy the iPads that I'm currently showing and currently talking about. Now, I'm not going to go over all the differences between every single iPad that's currently out on the market. I'm just going to talk a little bit about them, because primarily this video is not a comparison. It's mostly about the iPad Air 3. I also want to touch on the fact that Apple does indeed also have an iPad mini, which I did forget to talk about, and it slides in between, I think, the iPad Air and the iPad base model, which is the 7th generation, and that one's going to cost you, I think, $400 instead of $350, and $500 for the iPad Air 3 that you're currently looking at right now. The funny thing is, all of them have no sizes that are 9.7. Apple did continue 9.7. For the longest time, Apple used to have tablets that started at 9.7 inches for the base model and for the screen size, but no longer is that case. If you do end up buying the base model, you do get a 10.2-inch screen. This one that you are looking at right now, which is the iPad Air 3, the iPad Air 3 does actually have a 10.5-inch screen, and it's a pretty big screen, to be honest, and it's a very nice screen as well. I'll get to that later, but like I said, this one is a 10.5-inch screen, and then the Pros do have 11 and 12-inch screens as well, so they do have a fairly large sizes for the big boys. And then if you do get a smaller tablet, the iPad mini, I think it starts at around 8 inches as well. So you do have a lot of different options. Honestly, when it comes to Apple and when it comes to the screen size, I am actually glad that Apple did stray away from 9.7. 9.7 is not bad, and it still is very usable, but I am glad that Apple is finally realizing a little bit more screen real estate for the consumer is actually a very nice touch, and it can actually go a long way, especially if you're somebody who does a lot of multitasking, or maybe uses the Apple Pencil to draw, or maybe you watch a lot of videos on your device or something like that. Then that extra screen real estate may not seem like a big deal, but it is always nice to have that little extra room and things like that. You can see more on screen, of course, and I am glad no more 9.7, and it's actually pretty good. But let's go over the specs of this tablet right here, this iPad Air 3. You can see I do have the space gray one. If I flip it on the back, you will notice that this is exactly the space gray one. Now, when you buy the space gray one for the iPad Air is the only one in the lineup for the Airs that is going to have a black bezel. If you buy, I think, the silver, and if you buy the gold, you will have a white bezel. Again, I got this as a gift, so I really didn't have any say on what color of iPad that I was going to get. And this one is the 64 gig Wi-Fi only edition. I didn't get the cellular edition, or I didn't get anything more than 64 gig, so it is Wi-Fi 64 gig space gray. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this tablet, and I really can't complain, like I said, because I did get this as a late Christmas present, and I wasn't actually honestly expecting to get this. But a little bit about this tablet, like I said before, this is the thinnest and lightest tablet that Apple currently makes, outside of the iPad mini, of course. But in terms of the big sized iPads, this one is going to be the thinnest and lightest one. I keep bringing that up because it's actually interesting that the base model has a 10.2-inch screen, so that means the body is actually going to be a little bit smaller than this one by a couple of inches in terms of the actual how big the iPad is in terms of like the dimensions. But for some reason this one is the thinnest and lightest iPad out there in terms of the big ones. Just thought I would point that out there. Now when it comes to the actual processor of the iPad Air 3, it has 3 gig of RAM. It has the A12 Bionic processor from, I think, the iPhone XS and XS Max from 2018, I want to say. So it is maybe a year or 2 years old at this very moment as well. But if you compare this to the base model, which came out in September, which is the iPad 7th generation, which Apple still sells, the cheapest iPad you can buy that's full size. It's actually running a 5-year-old processor, and honestly, if I was a consumer and I was thinking about buying an iPad, I may just be a little bit iffy about that tablet. Well, it's a good tablet. It's just that if you plan on keeping your tablets for a very long time, let's say 4 or 5 years, which a lot of people actually do that. I can see why, because tablets are kind of expensive, and most time they do last that long in terms of the quality and in terms of everything. They can last that long. I would be iffy about the base model just because the base model can get quite laggy over time, and if you're worried about that, you may want to stray away from that, but that is still a very good deal. So it's glad to know that this one's running only a year or 2-year-old processor at this very moment. It's not running the latest and greatest from Apple. Of course, the latest and greatest from Apple right now would definitely be the processor in the iPhone 11 line. The iPhone 11 line definitely has the better processor. I cannot deny that, but like I said, this one still is a very good processor. On top of that, you do have a 10.5-inch screen. This one does support the Apple Pencil. Both the base one and this one do support the Apple Pencil. You will be getting a pencil that is the first generation Apple Pencil, so that means it won't charge magnetically on the iPad like the iPad Pro. You will have to charge the pencil on the actual lightning port on the bottom, and it will stick out when you're charging it, which is kind of silly and kind of not the greatest experience, but it is what it is. At least all the iPads now do support some form of Apple Pencil, whether it's the first generation or the brand new 2nd generation. It's still nice to know that they do care about productivity when it comes to the iPad. Alongside that, the nicest thing about this tablet also is the fact that it does got those connectors on the bottom, so that means you can connect Apple's own smart keyboard. The only problem with the smart keyboard and the actual Apple Pencil is they're both pretty expensive, taking in consideration this tablet already sits for the base model at $500 for the 64 gig variant, and we're talking I think $150 or $160 for the smart keyboard. It's very expensive, and then the Apple Pencil does run in at, I do believe, $99. So you can see it's not cheap at all. And honestly, I don't have a reason for the Apple Pencil, so I'm not going to be showing you the Apple Pencil, but you probably already seen the Apple Pencil everywhere because it's pretty common and a lot of people own the Apple Pencil. But for me, I don't have a reason for that. Also, I don't really think I have a reason for Apple's official smart keyboard, just because, well, I don't think I need a physical keyboard, and if I do need a physical keyboard, I can connect one via Bluetooth, or better yet, I can buy a case with a keyboard. It's just that I want one that's going to be slightly cheaper than what Apple is offering, because that is kind of high for what it is. The one thing this tablet does have, it does have the 2nd generation of the Touch ID right there with the home button, because it still does have a physical home button on it, and it is very fast and very fluid in my experience. I've had no problems with the Touch ID on this device, and I actually use the Touch ID all the time, and so far it's been a very good experience, and I actually really do like the experience there. The one thing I'm not too keen about this iPad is the fact that this iPad doesn't have the best cameras for an iPad. Actually, the cameras on here are cameras from, I think, the iPhone 6s or iPhone 7. They're not the greatest. If you flip it around on the back, it only shoots at 8 megapixel, and then on top of this tablet only shooting at 8 megapixel. It does shoot at 1080p video if you're taking videos and things like that. So you can see there is no 4K support on the actual cameras. Is that actually a big deal? No. And for a lot of people, even me myself included, I don't actually take a lot of photos and a lot of videos with it, but in a pinch, it still is nice to have them, so I can't say they're useless. They are actually pretty practical in a scenario where you would need to take a picture of something and actually send it somewhere. They are going to be very useful, so I am actually glad Apple did decide to actually put cameras on this device. The one nice thing I do like about this iPad in particular, I think the base model has it too, is the fact that if you look at the camera is actually flush with the body, so that means it doesn't stick out. So that means if you were to set this like on a counter or set this on like a flat surface, you don't actually have to worry about it rocking or sticking out a little bit, unlike the iPad Pro, where you know the camera does protrude out of the body a little bit. So when you sit on something, it's not the greatest experience. But to be honest, a lot of people are probably going to put a case on their iPad anyway, so it is what it is. But I just wanted to mention that as well, that it does have a camera that does not protrude. And talking about cameras really quickly, I also wanted to say that the front-facing camera on this device as well is not the greatest. It's, I would probably say maybe mediocre or a little bit better than mediocre, but it's definitely nothing to write home about and definitely nothing to get excited about. But it is very nice, especially when you need to take selfies or do a lot of video calls and things like that. It does come in handy, and I am glad they still actually have that on this device. And overall, the build quality of this is very nice and things like that. I also want to talk about me actually really liking this tablet in particular. Like I said at the beginning, I really do like that 10.5-inch screen. I really do think the 10.5-inch screen on here is actually very nice, and I actually think it is a very nice display. And I'm actually really glad, like I said, Apple could discontinue the 9.7 inches when it actually comes to the actual screen, because it's nice to have that little extra space when it comes to the screen. And I actually really am glad someone decided to get me this, because the 10.5-inch screen also means that I do get a little bit more space when I'm watching videos, when I'm like in split screen. Because one thing I do a lot on these tablets, I actually use the true multitasking. I just love the fact you can have two apps side by side, or in some instances now with iPad OS, you can have two of the same applications going. Like I know, for instance, the web browser is actually one instance where you can actually have two of the same Safari web browsers open at the same time. So it does make multitasking, or true multitasking, a little bit better, and I am glad, and I'm actually very happy. And I honestly, for me, if you were trying to decide between something like the iPad mini or the bigger versions, I personally would go with a bigger version, because prior to this, I did own the iPad mini 4, and well, while the iPad mini 4 was pretty good, it's just that nowadays we do have a lot of devices like smartphones, that smartphones keep tending to go bigger and bigger when it comes to the screen size, even for like the smaller sizes. So it is nice to have a little bit bigger screen, since 8 inches is so close to a smartphone size anyway. But I do have to make this clear, of course, it will be your preference, and I can see why a lot of people would want to go with the iPad mini, because you may be traveling with it a lot and you want a little bit bigger screen than something like a smartphone, but you don't want to carry around a laptop. And that's where I really think that this device is kind of still the middle ground, because it's not trying to be a laptop really, and it's not also trying to be a smartphone. It's somewhere still in the middle when it actually comes to the actual iPad itself. Now let's go ahead and boot this on. I'm going to show you around the iPad really, and I want to actually talk about if I can boot this up. I think I actually had it off or something, because I was not using it for like a couple days, just to see how well the battery would last if I turned it back on. But anyway, talking about the iPad Air, or talking about iPads in general, one thing I really did discover is the fact that if you look at the iPad that originally debuted back in 2010, when Steve Jobs actually released the iPad, one thing I really do realize nowadays is the fact that the iPad experience really hasn't changed all that much, to be honest. While it's not a bad experience, it's also not amazing experience, because like I said, this is literally the same experience we had since 2010. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. The one thing I do realize as well is, if you think about it and you're being super honest about iPads, or maybe tablets in general, especially the iPads, one thing to take a note is the fact that this tablet in particular is pretty much just a glorified iPhone. If you think about it, it pretty much runs the same operating system. However, that's not completely true, because this does have a modification of iOS, so you do get features that you cannot get on iOS, like true multitasking. True multitasking is a big reason why this stands out from something like an iPhone. And then on top of that, with the newly released iPad OS, you do get now, I think, native support for like file management, so you can plug in like hard drives, thumb drives, pretty much any mass storage device, and it will detect it natively in iPad OS. And in this video, I'm not really going to be talking all too much about iPad OS, because I could make an entirely separate video on iPad OS. But here it is right here, and here is the the screen right here. But yeah, I can see why some people out there just would not want to buy an iPad since it's extra money. And then on top of that, a lot of things you can do on your smartphone you can actually do on an iPad. Since an iPad's running the same software practically, it's not trying to be a laptop or a desktop computer with an actual desktop class OS like Mac OS or Windows. It's still a form of a mobile OS, and you can see between 2010 and 2020 pretty much they haven't changed the operating system. It's still that same experience with pretty much practically almost no customization, or not a lot you can do. You pretty much just have icons on the iPad screen, and you just touch them to go into them, and once you go into them you do whatever the application's supposed to do, and then you back out, and then you pretty much call it a day. And I'm going to be honest with that, it's an okay experience. It's not mind-blowing, and I can see why iPads maybe aren't as selling as well as they used to did when it first debuted in 2010, but I still do think that there is a place for iPads. Like I said, laptops may be a little bit too big for a lot of people, and then on top of laptops being a little bit too big for people, smartphones may not have the biggest screen. So this is like practically a very good middle ground for people who just want to do a lot of different things that you may not want to bring a laptop around for, or a smartphone just being a little bit too small. And one thing I actually like about Apple's products is the fact that if you look at this does have a very bright, very nice screen. I know this screen on all their iPads, they still only use LCD displays. They don't use OLED displays like you would find in a lot of smartphones or in TVs and things like that. But really the nice thing is Apple does make the best LCDs in the business, so I'm pretty sure you won't be disappointed. Now when I tried playing YouTube videos on this, I want to make this clear. As far as I know, this thing cannot play anything higher than 1080p. At least all the videos I saw, even if it was supposed to be a 4K video or like a 1440p 2K video, it would not play them. So I'm pretty sure this screen is still only tapped out at 1080p. Sure, there's other ways to play 4K video files, like natively, or like if you're on the internet and there's a website that does support 4K videos, you can actually get it to load, and they actually look slightly better. But in a lot of situations, especially YouTube, if you were wondering, you cannot play videos higher than I think 1080p. Although if you try the web browser, I'm pretty sure you can probably force it to get to 4K. But in general, this screen, I just wanted to make that clear, is not a 4K screen or even a 2K screen like a lot of smartphones nowadays with like 1440p screens. This is only rocking, I do believe, a 1080p screen. But in 2020, it really does show you that 4K screens are actually, or excuse me, 1080p screens are actually still enough, and it's not like you'll be disappointed with Apple's displays, because they are some fantastic displays. Another thing I actually really want to talk about when it comes to this iPad, I actually want to talk about how well this iPad is to hold, because like I said, this is the thinnest and lightest full-size iPad that Apple currently actually has to offer. And you can see I am holding this in one hand. Of course, over time this will get kind of heavy to hold, but I think this weighs around 1 pound. I'm not sure if it's over 1 pound a little bit or under 1 pound, but either way, this is very light, and it's around that 1 pound weight distribution. So I am actually glad that this is actually a very easy device to take around with you, to hold, to throw in a backpack and things like that. And the fact that this thing has a crazy 10.5 inch screen, and 10.5 may not seem too big, especially if you're used to something like a laptop, but you do have to realize that this thing is going to be in your face a lot, because a lot of times you are going to be holding it. You're not going to be using it like a traditional laptop where you have it laid on a table, unless you use the keyboard from Apple. But for me, I don't use the keyboard from Apple. I actually use this pretty much like a normal iPad, where I just hold it most of the time. And since I'm holding this most of the time and it's pretty close to my face most of the time, the 10.5 inch screen is pretty big, and it's really good that this does have a 10.5 inch screen. So I'm very happy about that. And overall, what can I say about the experience with iOS? It's a very good experience and things like that. I know in the last couple years, Apple has really been trying to make the iPad ecosystem a little bit closer to something like a traditional laptop or a desktop class operating system, but all I can say is it's not quite there, to be honest. But you do have a lot of little nice improvements. Like I said, you do have native file support now in iPad OS, which Apple changed the name from iOS to iPad OS, but let's be honest, it's really just a modification of the iOS from iPhone. And then on top of that, you do have really good multitasking. That's the biggest thing you will be getting here, aside from the iPhones. But that does make sense, just because iPhones do have pretty small screens, and a lot of people say, what's the point of having true multitasking even on even on Android smartphones when the screens aren't that big, even for true multitasking. But yes, that's one nice feature of having iPads. Since you have that nice big screen, you have a lot of real estate, you can use true multitasking where you can have apps side by side. And then on top of that, you can actually download files for the first time directly from the web browser from Safari natively. You do have to be on Safari, but if you do have Safari downloaded, you can download files natively. Any website you go to, for instance, maybe you're on your Gmail, your email, or Google Docs, or maybe Dropbox, and you're getting files sent to you, you just click download and they'll automatically start downloading in the web browser, kind of like you have on your computer or your laptop and things like that. So that's a very nice implementation. And then outside of that, I think there is some other improvements, like for instance on iPadOS. I know I wasn't going to talk about iPadOS too much, but I just wanted to touch on this. They also added a feature where you can actually load web pages that are desktop class web pages now, so you don't have to force the web browser to actually load desktop sites now. Basically what it does is to make things simple, it pretty much just allows you to read the same website you would be reading on like your laptop or your desktop computer, which I am a pretty big fan of, because before this, you guys know, anytime you had a mobile OS, whether it's Android or iOS or now iPadOS, usually what would happen was when you go to a website, the layout would be a little bit different just because, well, you're using a mobile device, so it would always bring up the mobile version of like the website if you were on the actual web browser on a mobile device. But now it is going to be the desktop class site, and it's nice, you don't have to force it to the desktop class site. So it is nice, you don't have to force the desktop class site, and that's something I'm really actually very happy about. So basically what I'm saying is, you can see they are trying to make this closer to a desktop class OS, kind of like Mac OS or Windows, but it's still not there yet. And when you use this thing, you really do still kind of feel like you are in mobile technology, or you're using a mobile device. Granted, of course, this is a mobile device, but just the fact that it's really still meant for a touch input, and it's really still that iPad that we had in 2010. I can see why some people just flat out would not want to get one of these. It doesn't make sense in their life. But for me personally, I still think there is a space for the iPad, and iPads are still very useful since they're a little bit smaller than a laptop and things like that. And overall, I've been very happy with this. The one nice thing I do love about iPads is the fact that iPads get some of the best battery on the market when it comes to tablets. I'm easily getting around 10 hours of battery life, and that's pretty much what Apple claims when it comes to the iPad. The nice thing about the iPads, no matter what version you buy or what model of iPads you buy in their current lineup, they all claim to get the same battery, and they all also claim to get the same operating system. So they're all running iPadOS, no matter whether you buy the iPad Pros, the iPad Air, or the iPad base model. You're all going to be running iPadOS, which is actually extremely nice, and I'm actually very happy about that they actually do support that. And I can't really show you around iOS because honestly, I don't know what I'd be showing you around iOS. It's pretty much the same experience that you may have seen way back in the day, even back in 2010, to be honest. The iPadOS or iOS mobile operating system hasn't changed all too much. There is a lot more I could actually talk about, but I don't really want to make this video a video where I ramble on about iPadOS and all the changes of iPadOS. I might make a separate video about iPadOS, although there is already a lot of videos out there explaining all you can do in iPadOS. I love the fact that, like I said, I just love the fact that this thing is a beast when it comes to multitasking. I will have to make this clear, even though this iPad Air is pretty much a beast at multitasking, and I'm very happy of the performance of this tablet, it will not beat something like a desktop computer or like a laptop in terms of true multitasking, because that's where laptops and desktops are true desktop class OSs really beat out mobile OSs, because you can have multiple tabs open easier in that. You can drag stuff around the screen. Overall, the experience is going to be better. But for a mobile OS, iPadOS is nothing to slouch about, and iPadOS is absolutely amazing. And I am actually very happy with my iPad. And the other thing I'm very happy about, going back really quickly to the actual battery life, I love the fact that when you have iPads, the standby time is absolutely phenomenal. We can pretty much all agree on that. I remember when I had my iPad Mini 4, my iPad Mini 4 was an actual device that I had where I left it on the table for about maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and literally I only lost like 1 or 2% of battery. That's how good Apple is when it comes to optimizing the battery with the software. And apparently they just put super big batteries in their devices, even though their devices are super thin. They just know how to make everything work together, and the battery life is phenomenal. That's one of the main reasons why you would actually buy an iPad over something like maybe the Samsung offerings, or maybe some of the other Android tablets that are very cheap and things like that. And then on top of that, I would highly recommend an iPad over something other in the tablet space 100%, because I can't admit this, I'm not really an Apple fan when it comes to their products in general. I do like some of their products, but when it comes to their iPhones, I don't actually like their iPhones. Not that I hate them for any bad reason, they just don't work for me. And for me personally, I'm an Android fan, but I can admit when it comes to tablets, I would definitely go to Apple over anything else. At least when it comes to traditional tablets that you think of like this, or like an Android tablet, I would go with one of the iPads, because the thing is with iPad, they support their tablets so long, like 5 or 6 years, where on the Android side, nobody really owns the Google certification for Android, so they have to get the certification from Google. And a lot of times, like Samsung or other companies, only give you like 2 years or maybe not even 3 years of support. It's just the sad truth, because I've had Android tablets in the past. And then the other thing wrong with Android tablets, talking about Android tablets, a lot of times some of the applications are not actually optimized for the bigger screen. You're pretty much just getting smartphone type applications on your actual Android device. Actually, I do have to point this out really quickly. Even though this is 2020, some developers out there, there's not many, but there are some developers you can actually stumble upon when you actually go to their application. It's not actually optimized for the bigger screens of the iPad. So that means if you do have an iPad, you will pretty much just get an iPhone application that's meant to run on their iPhones on the actual tablet, and it's not the greatest experience. I'm not going to show you one, because the ones that I have personal information on them, unfortunately, but just take my word for it, and you'll 100% know what I'm talking about if you download an application that doesn't have an iPad optimized app. You can tell it's just made for an iPhone, and that's where it's supposed to work. So it's unfortunate that some developers out there that are releasing iPad apps still can't actually figure out how to actually optimize their apps for this. The nice thing I also love about this is, especially if you have like an iPad with very low storage, maybe you buy the base model or buy this model and you're running low on storage, a lot of times I'm actually finding myself not using certain applications. Like for instance, I'm a big fan of Reddit, but now that it actually has desktop class web browsing on the actual Safari web browser, I don't need a Reddit anymore, the actual application. I just use Reddit in the actual Safari web browser, just because, well, it saves me a little bit of space, and the fact that it's actually optimized for the screen now, and since the screen's pretty big, you get the same type of web browsing experience you would get on something like a laptop or a desktop computer. So that's something I'm actually very happy about as well. I wanted to point that out. So 2 thumbs up to Apple for actually adding that as one of the nicest features, at least for me. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I'm definitely actually glad I got this, and I don't actually miss my iPad mini line. I probably would never go back to the iPad mini. That's one of the biggest reasons why I sold my iPad mini, and I only had it for like 2 or 3 years, just because, well, I didn't like the fact the screen was just a little bit too small. And I did do a lot of true multitasking, and if you're thinking about doing a lot of true multitasking, maybe writing or watching a lot of videos, I would definitely consider one of the bigger options, whether it's the base model or the iPad Air or the iPad Pro, just because you do have more screen real estate and things like that. And overall, I'm very happy with this device. One thing I am going to be curious about is how well this thing's going to hold up over time in terms of like lag, in terms of like speed and things like that, because I actually heard in the iPad Pros, some people were actually complaining. I know this is not the iPad Pro, of course, but one thing some people were complaining with the iPad Pros, which is actually funny, it does have a little bit better specs than this. It has 4 gig of RAM and a A12X instead of the A12 processor this has, so it's slightly better with the GPU and with the the more gig of RAM. One thing people were actually complaining was the fact that it wasn't good at actually multitasking, because it got kind of maybe laggy, or maybe the fact that when they actually went to go ahead and switch applications, applications wouldn't actually reload. They would have to refresh in the background and things like that. So I think that's a very interesting. And if some people were already complaining that the iPad Pros had bad RAM management, I think it's called, then this one may end up having bad RAM management as well. But at least for me so far, I haven't really experienced any problems in terms of like any slowdown or any performance when I'm multitasking and things like that. And then there is some other things I think I actually wanted to talk about when it comes to this iPad specifically, but on the top of my head I really can't think of what I actually wanted to talk about when it comes to this iPad. Overall, I'm just very happy with this iPad. I guess I can talk about the bezels, because I was a fan when I had all my other tablets, whether it's Android tablets or whether it's the last iPad I owned. I want to say that I did have tablets with a white bezels on the front. And you may actually be asking yourself, what color do you go with when it comes to the bezels on the front? Do you go with white bezels or black bezels if you have like the base iPad, or if you have the iPad Air? I will say, now thinking about it, I am actually maybe more slightly bigger fan of the black bezel, just because these devices still have a bezel. It's pretty thick, and since it does have a bezel, the black bezel actually makes it blend in a little bit better, especially like when you're watching movies, when you're watching TV shows, when you're browsing the web. It does stick out. It's not as noticeable, I mean. But then again, white bezels are pretty nice. Even though you can notice white bezels, they're not that big of a distraction, and I've used them in the past. And personally, if I got a white iPad by some instance, I would still use it, and they still are very nice to look at. So it's really just personal preference. But maybe if I was to buy one again and I actually was choosing the color, I would choose one with a black bezel, because like I said, I just stated, it makes the bezels look a little bit less out of the way. So there's that for that. And that's, I think, pretty much all I wanted to talk about in this video. I know this video was an extremely long video, but I really want to talk about everything I wanted to talk about, since like literally I haven't owned an iPad in quite some time, and it's been a very long time since I actually owned one. But overall, I'm very happy with it, and I've actually been using this tablet for a very long time. I usually use it like 5 or 6 hours a day, because I love the experience. I love that 10.5-inch screen. Overall, I love multitasking. I just love everything about this tablet. So I guess I'm gonna go ahead and head out of here and call this a video a day. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.